Welcome to Simplified UPSC by PPP, where we listen, learn, and grow together. Detailed lecture notes in English and Hindi, plus practice questions for prelims and mains, only on our Telegram channel. Link in description. Like and subscribe for more.
Welcome back to the Simplified UPSC by PPP channel. We're diving deep into the disaster management curriculum today, and we're tackling section 2.5 on drought. This is a really critical topic, and one that I think is often misunderstood. We tend to think of it as just, a lack of rain. But it's so much more. It's really a systemic resource management failure, and that's what we want to unpack. Before we really get into the analysis, though, a quick but heartfelt call to action. If you're finding this deep dive series useful for your preparation, if these discussions are helping you connect the dots, please do consider joining as a YouTube member. Your memberships, well, they honestly keep us motivated to bring you these kinds of videos, and they allow us to keep providing these high-quality thought partner resources for your whole journey.
And on that note, a sincere member shout out, a really profound thank you to all of our existing members. Your support is genuinely what enables us to systematically break down these, pretty dense textbooks for the entire community. It lets us spend the time we need to give you the essential context and the policy depth you need to master a complex subject like this one.
Exactly. So our mission today is to thoroughly unpack the concept of drought. It's a complex hazard, a kind of creeping crisis, which means it needs very specific preparedness strategies, ones that are tailored to its unique, slow-onset nature. We've got a whole stack of sources here that treat drought not just as a meteorological event, but as an ecological, an economic, and a social crisis. Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack the real policy implications. When we talk about disaster management, the focus is usually on those sudden shocks, right? A cyclone, a flash flood, a big earthquake. These things have very clear start and end points. But drought is completely different. It's a process.
It is. It's a creeping crisis, as you said. The core definition we work with is that drought is the absence or deficiency of rainfall from its normal pattern in a region. And this lasts for an extended period, which ultimately leads to general societal suffering. But what's so often missed in that kind of concise definition is the fundamental relational aspect of it.
The relational aspect. What do you mean by that exactly?
That's really the pivot point for all effective drought policy. It's not just about the weather. It's an interplay between the demand that people place on the natural water supply and the natural event, the lack of rain that restricts that supply in a given region. It's a crisis of expectation meeting a new reality.
So you could have the same amount of rainfall deficiency in two different places, but a totally different impact depending on the demand.
Precisely. If you keep that rainfall deficit constant, but you dramatically increase a community's capacity to store water or manage it or even just reduce their dependence on it, you mitigate the drought's impact significantly.
Yeah.
That's why we have to label it a systemic failure, not just a bad weather report.
And this relational nature, this brings us right to the defining characteristic of drought in the disaster cycle, that it is a slow onset disaster. Unlike a cyclone where your preparation window is, hours? Maybe a few days?
Exactly. Days at most. With drought, the onset is measured in weeks, months, or sometimes even years. And that point dictates the entire management and, frankly, the funding strategy. Because it's such a gradual progression, it's incredibly difficult to demarcate the precise time of its onset and its end.
There's no single event you can point to and say, the drought started today.
No, not at all. And that lack of a sudden visible shock, it creates a huge amount of bureaucratic inertia. You don't get that clean break of a pre-disaster state and then an immediate response phase. It creeps up on the system. It gradually exhausts the resilience of the community long before the crisis is officially recognized.
Before the media attention hits.
And before government funds are officially released, yes. This is why it necessitates these sophisticated, continuous monitoring mechanisms. You have to track depletion trends over the long term. You can't just rely on rapid evacuation protocols like you would for a flood.
Okay, but I want to challenge that point just a little. If it's truly a slow onset disaster, and we know demand is always increasing, why do governments so often wait until the crisis is absolutely critical? When the reservoir levels hit rock bottom. Why do they wait until then to invest in these big long-term solutions like groundwater recharge? I mean, doesn't the very nature of a slow onset crisis mean that the mitigation phase should get, 90% of the effort?
That is the absolute core policy dilemma. You've hit the nail on the head, political will and funding. They tend to follow visible crises. Drought, because of its creeping nature, just lacks that immediate visibility. And this is tied directly to a fundamental economic principle our sources talk about, the imbalance in supply.
The imbalance in supply.
Yes. The crucial factor in determining the severity of a drought is this imbalance. It's the gap between the available water and the societal need for that water. And when you have a high-demand society, even the smallest meteorological deficiency can tip that balance very, very quickly into a severe drought. The margin of safety is just so thin.
And the outcome of that thin margin, that high demand, that's what's quantified as a negative balance in the regional water budget, right? We start drawing down our reserves, the reservoirs, the groundwater way, faster than they're being replenished.
Precisely. And we have to remember the global context here, which I think often gets forgotten in these regional discussions. Yes, 80% of the Earth is covered in water, but only a tiny, tiny fraction, about 1%, is actually usable fresh water.
Only 1%. That's a shocking number.
It is. And of that total fresh water, about 75% of it is frozen in the polar regions and in glaciers. Another 22.6% is stored as groundwater. That leaves almost nothing as easily accessible surface water. So when a drought strikes, that tiny, highly leveraged supply gets depleted, and you get that negative balance, the challenge is stark. Earth is not going to generate more water. We have to manage that existing 1% with incredible efficiency.
This inherent scarcity, and there's the slow progression of the crisis, it forces us to be much more technically rigorous in how we define things. We can't just look at a rain gauge and call it a day.
Yeah.
The sources categorize drought into 4 distinct types that happen in a sequence, right? It starts with the meteorological event, and then it ends in a full-blown socio-economic impact. We should probably detail these for our listeners.
Absolutely. This taxonomy is foundational for anyone studying disaster management. It helps clarify why a simple rainfall deficit doesn't immediately translate into a famine. There are steps in between.
Okay, so let's start with the trigger. The first one is meteorological drought.
Right. Meteorological drought is the simplest definition. It's just the abscess or deficit of rainfall from its normal historical average in a specific region. And the Indian Meteorological Department, the IMD, has established very clear criteria for identifying this onset.
And what are those criteria?
A drought is officially declared when the deficiency exceeds 25% of the normal precipitation for that area. If that deficit is somewhere between 26 and 50%, it gets classified as a moderate meteorological drought.
Okay, so 26 to 50% is moderate. What's severe?
If the deficit is more than 50%, well, then it's declared as severe, and that's when the big alarm bells start ringing.
Okay, so that's the trigger. The rain stops falling, or at least falls way less than it should. What's the next stage in this process? What's the next domino?
That leads directly to hydrological drought. This is the consequence of that rainfall deficit on our actual water systems, both on the surface and below ground. You start to see a measurable reduction of natural stream flows. The water levels in reservoirs and lakes drop, and critically, the groundwater levels decline. The system that sustains our long-term needs, our reserves, is being depleted.
And this type of drought can be delayed, right? It doesn't happen the instant the rain stops.
That's a great point. It's often delayed relative to the meteorological drought because the whole system relies on stored runoff from previous wetter seasons. It takes time for the lack of new input to drain the existing system.
Right. And for most people, I think the crisis only becomes truly real when the food supply is threatened. And that's the next stage, agricultural drought.
Correct. Agricultural drought is defined by the consequence of that hydrological failure on the soil itself. It's characterized by insufficient soil moisture to sustain crop growth at the required stages. This leads to crop stress, reduced yields, and eventually total crop failure. This is the stage that's particularly devastating for subsistence farmers, and if it goes on for long enough, it can lead to famine. This is where that meteorological event has fully translated into economic vulnerability.
And that leads us to the final broadest category, which kind of captures the total societal cost.
Yes, that is socio-economic drought. This one correlates all the physical drought types, the meteorological, hydrological, and agricultural, with the supply and demand of all sorts of goods and services that depend on water. Things like food, of course, but also electricity from hydropower and industrial output. When the supply of these goods can't meet the demand because of water scarcity, we were officially in a socioeconomic drought. The impact just cascades through the entire economy.
It affects livelihoods far beyond just the farming community.
Far beyond, everyone is impacted at that stage.
This detailed progression really explains why defining drought just by milliliters of rain is so insufficient. And that brings us to this remarkable paradox mentioned in our source material. We absolutely need to talk about the Cherrapunji case, or what was mentioned as the Kerala paradox, to really make this point stick.
It is an essential example. It's counterintuitive, but so important for anyone studying resource management. Take a region like Cherrapunji in Meghalaya, historically one of the wettest places on Earth. It gets over 11,000 millimeters of rain a year. Or consider Kerala, which receives over 3,000 millimeters. Despite this staggering volume of water, far more than any arid region could dream of, these areas often reel under drinking water problems. They can even be officially declared drought-affected.
But how? Why? If you have 3,000 millimeters of rain, surely you have enough water.
It's entirely a failure of storage and geology. It's not about how much rain falls, it's about how much you can hold on to. The rainfall in these places is often concentrated in a very, very short monsoon window. And because the topography is steep and the soil structure might be poor or non-retentive, the vast majority of that water just becomes runoff.
It just rushes away.
It rushes straight into the ocean or down to the plains. It leaves insufficient moisture to sustain crops or drinking water needs during the long ensuing dry season. The supply becomes insufficient to support key needs, like sustaining 2 good crops in Kerala's case, or providing clean drinking water year-round in Cherrapunji's. It's because the water is not retained. It's not allowed to percolate into the ground. So the problem shifts from a lack of water to a lack of access and retention.
Okay, so for the learner, for the person studying this, the key takeaway from this first part is that drought is a slow-onset disaster. It's characterized by the sequential failure that starts with meteorology, which then leads to a persistent imbalance in supply, and that results in a negative balance in the overall water budget. And this whole structure proves that managing drought is fundamentally about managing storage and retention, not just hoping for meteorological luck.
That's the perfect summary. It's an engineering problem at its core.
All right, so given that core finding, that the severity of a drought is really determined by our capacity to retain and manage water, the strategic focus in disaster management has to shift heavily toward the pre-disaster phase, right? Towards long-term mitigation and building resilience.
It has to. We have to treat every single millimeter of rain as a critical resource that must be conserved. You can't control the monsoon deficit, as you said, but you can absolutely increase the capacity of the land and the community to handle that deficit when it comes.
And this conservation effort, it has to be comprehensive. It's not just about the physical lack of water, it's also about the economic and social vulnerabilities of the population.
Exactly. We have to weave together these robust structural measures, so physical construction, with equally important non-structural measures, which are about policy and planning.
Okay, let's break down the structural measures cited in our materials. Let's start with the one intervention that directly counters that runoff issue we saw in Kerala and Cherrapunji: rainwater harvesting.
Rainwater harvesting, or RWH, is probably the most vital preparedness activity. It involves constructing structures specifically designed to collect and store precipitation. And this can range from, simple rooftop collection systems in cities all the way to farm ponds and check dams in rural landscapes. These systems are all about capturing the water that does fall so it can be used later. It directly minimizes that immediate negative water balance.
It's about maximizing every single localized opportunity for storage.
That's it.
But localizing storage on the surface, that faces a huge constraint in warm regions, which is evaporation. You mentioned earlier that over 22% of the world's fresh water is underground. So how do we tap into that subterranean reservoir? This brings us to the need for structures that facilitate percolation.
Yes. Percolation is arguably the single most critical long-term strategy, especially in regions that have that high seasonal rainfall followed by long, dry periods. Percolation is simply the process by which water seeps into the ground to recharge those vital groundwater reserves. And that groundwater, once it's been recharged, is generally available year-round. And it has minimal evaporation loss compared to surface water bodies like lakes or reservoirs. It's a much more efficient way to store water.
So what specific structures do we use to maximize this percolation? I'm guessing it's not just about digging a hole in the ground.
No, it requires some pretty specialized engineering that's linked to the specific geology of the area. We use structures like percolation tanks. These are basically shallow water storage bodies built in strategic locations, often along streams or larger drainage lines. Their job is to hold the accumulated water for the maximum amount of time to allow it to seep into the ground. We also use contour bunding, which are earthen embankments built along the contour lines in farm fields, and nala bunds, which are small check dams on streams. Their primary function isn't really storage for direct use, but storage for recharge. This systematic effort to recharge groundwater is what forms the backbone of all successful drought mitigation models.
Okay, so that's moving from individual structures to a more holistic approach. Let's talk about watershed management. Why is this approach considered the kind of the gold standard for resource management in drought-prone areas?
Watershed management is so effective because it rejects that piecemeal approach. It treats a defined geographical area, the watershed, which is all the land that drains into a common water body, as a single interconnected unit. It's a holistic approach for effective land and water resources management within that area, and it follows what's known as a ridge-to-valley principle.
Ridge to valley, what does that actually entail in practice?
It means the interventions start at the highest points of the basin, up on the ridges. Up there, the measures focus on controlling soil erosion and promoting afforestation. This is often called social fencing, where the community agrees to protect the local forests. Then, as the water moves down the slopes, you use contour bunding and trenches to slow the runoff. This promotes in situ moisture conservation right there in the fields. And finally, down in the valley floors, you build the larger structures like check dams and percolation tanks to maximize the recharge before the water leaves the system completely. It's an integrated approach that ensures every drop of water is utilized before it exits the watershed. And it simultaneously addresses water scarcity, soil erosion, and biodiversity loss.
That explains the structural measures, which sound expensive but obviously necessary. Now let's switch to the non-structural measures. These are particularly essential for those vulnerable groups like subsistence farmers. We need to detail crop contingency plans. These are crucial for reducing the loss, is that right?
Absolutely. Crop contingency plans are essential agricultural drought management strategies. They fall squarely under the umbrella of reducing loss. They involve these pre-planned measures designed to adapt farming practices immediately as soon as rainfall deficits occur. These plans are designed to prevent an agricultural drought from just spiraling into a total economic collapse for a family or a community.
So what specific adjustments do these contingency plans typically involve? Is it just about planting different things?
It focuses on three main areas. First, yes, shifting to short-duration crops that require less water over a shorter period. This maximizes the utility of whatever soil moisture is available. Second, intercropping with drought-tolerant legumes or pulses. So, if the main cash crop fails, the farmers still have some yield, and as a bonus, they improve their soil health. And third, adjusting the planting protocol. This could mean delaying the sowing of crops or using water-efficient methods like drip irrigation if it's available. These non-structural adaptations are often the fastest and most cost-effective way to reduce that immediate agricultural vulnerability.
To bring all these tools together, both structural and non-structural, our source material highlights this extraordinary success story that really serves as a template for decentralized drought mitigation. We have to talk about Ralegan Siddhi.
The transformation of Ralegan Siddhi in Maharashtra under Anna Hazare, it's a textbook case. It's a perfect example of successful watershed management and community capacity building. Decades ago, this was a village that was just reeling from acute poverty, water scarcity, illicit liquor production, severe land degradation. It was in a terrible state.
And what was the key intervention? What turned that whole situation around?
It was the systematic, community-driven application of every principle we've just discussed. They implemented a full ridge-to-valley watershed management plan. They built continuous contour trenches, nala bunds, and percolation tanks all across the region. But critically, the community itself enforced the non-structural rules. They adopted social fencing to halt free grazing. They imposed a ban on water-intensive crops like sugarcane and banana. And they mandated the switch to water-efficient crops like pulses and millets, which is a perfect example of a crop contingency plan just becoming the new normal.
And the quantifiable impact. What were the results of this holistic approach?
The results were just dramatic. The continuous percolation led to a steady rise in the groundwater table. This increased the irrigated area from a mere 80 acres to nearly 1,300 acres. The once impoverished village transformed into an economically prosperous community, and it demonstrated that drought mitigation is less about high-tech, top-down solutions and more about effective, decentralized water conservation and demand management. It showed that building capacity directly reduces vulnerability.
Finally, we have to touch on drought monitoring. Given that it's a slow-onset disaster, why is real-time, continuous monitoring so foundational to this particular disaster type?
Monitoring is the early warning system for a creeping crisis. It's what allows management to shift from being reactive to being proactive or anticipatory. The process involves the continuous observation of three main factors, all measured against a baseline of historical averages and required demand. One, the current rainfall situation in the region, so you're tracking those IMD criteria. Two, the water availability in reservoirs, lakes, rivers, and crucially, groundwater. And three, the comparison of these findings against the required water needs of all the different sectors, agriculture, industry, drinking water. This systematic data collection allows policymakers to identify a developing negative balance well before the suffering becomes acute. It lets them trigger those contingency plans proactively, rather than waiting for the crisis to physically manifest in empty fields and dry taps.
Okay, so now that we've detailed the mechanism of drought and the tools we use to fight it, let's zoom out a bit. If we connect all this to the bigger picture, especially for those of you preparing for examinations, the entire impact of drought, the disaster itself, is defined by these fundamental concepts of vulnerability, capacity, and risk. We need to use the foundational definitions from the source material to place drought firmly within that broader disaster management framework.
That's essential. You often see disaster simplified as a function of hazard and vulnerability, often with capacity subtracted from that. So let's clarify how drought factors into that, starting with the difference between hazard and vulnerability.
Right, so the hazard is the trigger, the potential event. In the context of drought, this is purely the meteorological phenomenon, right? The rainfall deficiency that leads to the environmental condition we call drought.
Exactly. Now, vulnerability is the degree to which a community or an area is likely to be damaged or disrupted by that hazard. And critically, vulnerability is deeply influenced by the socioeconomic conditions of the population. Poverty, for instance, just massively exacerbates the inability to cope. If you're a landless laborer or a small subsistence farmer, you are highly vulnerable to even a moderate drought because you have no financial reserves, no alternative livelihoods to fall back on.
In disaster analysis, we often hear about three components of risk: hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. Where does exposure fit into the drought context?
Exposure defines what elements are actually located in the hazard zone. In a drought, the exposed elements are things like subsistence agriculture, water-dependent industries, and any community that relies on rain-fed storage. So while the rainfall deficit, the hazard, might be uniform across an entire district, the people in concrete homes with private bore wells have very low vulnerability, whereas the people living in poorly constructed homes who rely solely on an open village pond have very high vulnerability and high exposure to that water deficit. The risk, the expected loss, is therefore concentrated in those highly exposed and highly vulnerable segments of society.
Which brings us back to that crucial idea of building resilience through action, the role of capacity.
Capacity is the direct countermeasure to vulnerability. It's the ability of an individual or a community to cope with, resist, and recover from a disaster. And the relationship, as we saw so clearly in the Ralegan Siddhi example, is direct. Capacity reduces vulnerability. If a community has high capacity things like collective wealth, established community governance over water usage, robust infrastructure like rainwater harvesting structures, and established alternative livelihoods, then the disaster's impact is drastically reduced, even if the low rainfall persists for a long time. Wealth reduces vulnerability because it provides buffers and it provides options.
So by implementing decentralized structural measures like RWH and policy measures like crop contingency plans, we are directly building the capacity that mitigates the risk. So how is this all finalized in the definition of risk itself?
Risk is the measure of expected losses from a hazard event occurring in a given area over a specific time period. It's a calculation, and it's determined by the nature of the hazard, the vulnerability of the elements affected, and the economic value of those elements. So when the drought hazard strikes, if you've invested heavily in structural measures and social programs, you have simultaneously reduced vulnerability and increased capacity, and the result is a low overall risk profile.
Let's talk about risk reduction specifically in the drought context. What are the most effective practical policy levers to reduce that risk?
Risk reduction for drought is really defined by two simultaneous approaches, and they're driven by the measures we talked about in Part 2. First, you have to focus on reducing vulnerability through physical buffering. This includes your structural measures, investing in rainwater harvesting systems, building check dams, and large-scale coordinated efforts like watershed management. These physically enhance the system's capacity to retain water. Second, you have to focus on reducing losses through non-structural adaptation. Implementing those pre-designed crop contingency plans means the economic sector doesn't just collapse, it adapts. This reduces the immediate financial and material loss.
Our sources also point out that there are specific groups that are disproportionately impacted, the most vulnerable segments of society. Can you elaborate on who constitutes these groups and what underlying factors increase their risk?
Yes, the most vulnerable groups typically include herdsmen and pastoral communities. Their entire livelihood depends on accessible grazing lands, which are the first things to dry up. Also, landless laborers who lose their only source of income when farm work disappears. And of course, subsistence farmers who just lack the financial cushion to survive a single crop failure. We also have to acknowledge the specific vulnerability of women and children who often bear the increased burden of fetching water over much longer distances during a crisis.
And what are the systemic factors that kind of lock these groups into a state of perpetual vulnerability?
Those factors are often man-made, and they exacerbate the natural hazard. They include unsustainable practices like overgrazing, which leads to soil loss and reduces percolation. Also, deforestation, which removes the natural buffers and increases that destructive runoff. And a big one is adopting water-consuming cropping patterns, often driven by market forces, which can quickly deplete water reserves and really increase that negative balance. Addressing these behavioral and policy factors is just as important as building the physical structures.
Okay, finally, let's wrap this section up by placing drought squarely in the disaster management cycle. How do all these concepts of monitoring, mitigation, and recovery fit into that cyclical framework?
Given the nature of this crisis, the pre-disaster phase, which is mitigation and preparedness, is disproportionately important for drought. It's almost everything. This phase requires long-term, sustained actions. Maximizing your groundwater reserves through percolation techniques, for example. It also means developing alternative drought-resistant livelihoods, like raising goats or focusing on non-timber forest produce, and establishing robust community awareness campaigns. If the pre-disaster phase fails, the response phase becomes exponentially more costly and less effective.
Okay, so what defines the during phase, the response?
Once the IMD criteria are met and a drought is officially declared, the response phase kicks in. The critical activity here is that continuous, granular drought monitoring to observe water availability and compare it against needs in real time. The physical response involves immediate relief, distributing emergency drinking water, providing fodder for livestock, and rapidly implementing those non-structural strategies like triggering the crop contingency plans and offering immediate wage labor alternatives for landless workers.
And then the post-disaster phase, recovery.
Recovery must focus not just on restoring what was lost, but on building back better capacity. That's key. So it involves restoring the damaged agricultural systems, replenishing seed and livestock stocks, and crucially, investing in enhanced water infrastructure, specifically expanding and maintaining the rainwater harvesting and percolation structures to ensure higher resilience for the inevitable next cycle. For drought, the recovery phase has to transition immediately back into an aggressive mitigation phase. The cycle must be strengthened.
This systematic breakdown really provides the learner with clear tools to analyze Section 2.5. We've established that drought is fundamentally managed through enhanced capacity, maximized in that pre-disaster phase, primarily using water conservation, watershed management, and systematic groundwater recharge techniques. So after all that, what does this all mean? We've taken this deep dive to really show that drought, the quintessential slow-onset disaster, is fundamentally an engineering and resource management problem that's just disguised as a meteorological one.
Exactly. The disaster happens when the socioeconomic system lacks the capacity to manage the imbalance in supply.
And that results in a persistent negative balance in the water budget. The success of our mitigation efforts, whether we're looking at top-down policy or community action like Ralegan Siddhi, it hinges entirely on our ability to manage demand and maximize that critical geological process of percolation across entire watersheds.
We really hope this deep dive has provided you with clear definitions of the core concepts, from the 4 sequential types of drought to the IMD criteria. And we've specifically focused on how structural and non-structural strategies like rainwater harvesting, watershed management, and crop contingency plans all play a crucial role in reducing the vulnerability of exposed populations, which is key for UPSC examination readiness.
Understanding that building capacity through these coordinated actions directly reduces risk is the central insight here. Thank you for joining us for this extensive deep dive into Section 2.5 of the Disaster Management Syllabus.
But before we wrap up, a final provocative thought for you to consider, building on that Kerala and Cherrapunji paradox. If a community has limited resources and the goal is long-term resilience against drought, which is the most critical intervention, is it ensuring the water is collected and stored on the surface, like in a large reservoir or a farm pond? Or is it ensuring the water is retained by increasing percolation to replenish groundwater?
Yeah, think about the trade-offs there. Think about evaporation losses, land acquisition costs, and the long-term sustainability of each approach. Think about the sustainability. Does surface water storage merely postpone the crisis for a season, or does robust underground recharge provide truly sustainable multi-year capacity? Don't forget to join our community via YouTube membership for more specialized UPSC content. We'll see you in the next deep dive.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Telegram and Instagram. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.